The wind in Sagebrush Crossing had teeth, and in the winter of '73, it bit with a vengeance. It was a raw, scouring force that swept down from the Laramie Mountains, carrying ice and the grit of 1,000 barren miles. It howled through the gaps between the rough-hewn buildings of the town's single dusty street, piling snow into drifts that swallowed fence posts and turned the world a uniform, blinding white, inside McKee's Mercantile, the only bastion of warmth and light for 50 miles. The very timbers groaned under the assault. The pot-bellied stove in the center of the room glowed a fierce cherry red, but its heat seemed to reach only a few feet before the cold clawed it back. Nora Hale stood as far from the stove as she could while still feeling a hint of its life. To get too close was to accept charity, a weakness she could not afford. She held her daughter, Lily, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, her own body a thin shield against the drafts that snaked across the floorboards. At 23, Nora's face had the stark, fine-boned beauty of a winter landscape, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a weariness that belonged to someone twice her age. Grief had carved delicate lines around them, but desperation had drawn them taut. Lily coughed, a dry, rasping sound that tore at Nora's heart with each rattling breath. The child's small body was limp in her arms, her head hot against Nora's shoulder, 8 years old, and she weighed little more than a sack of flour. The fever had taken her strength, leaving her skin pale and translucent, a faint blue tracery of veins visible at her temples. Nora tightened her grip, her knuckles white, in her coat pocket. Her fingers found the few coins left to her name, $3 silver and a handful of cents, a fortune a year ago, an insult now. Across the room, leaning against a stack of flour sacks, a man watched them. He didn't stare, not in the way other men did. His gaze was quiet, steady, and held a peculiar sort of stillness. This was Caleb Hart, at 31. He was a man made of long lines and quiet strength. From his sun-creased eyes to his calloused, capable hands, he was a rancher, his small homestead a few miles out of town, a place he worked alone since, well, for a while now. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, worn but clean, and his hat sat low, shadowing eyes that saw more than they let on. He had seen Nora Hale and her daughter arrive in town a month prior on the back of a freight wagon, a small trunk their only possession. He'd seen the hope in her eyes slowly dim, replaced by the grim practicality of survival. He saw it now, in the rigid set of her jaw and the way she shielded her child from the world. The Mercantile was the town's social hub, a place of commerce and quiet judgment. Mr. McKee, a man whose bald head and fringe of white hair made him look like a weary monk, polished the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew everyone's business. Near the pickle barrel, 2 trappers argued in low tones about the price of beaver pelts. And by the window, casting a long and disapproving shadow, sat Mrs. Violet Purdy, as the self-appointed president of the Sagebrush Ladies' Temperance and Moral Reform Society. Mrs. Purdy saw sin in every corner and impropriety in every shadow. Her lips were perpetually pursed, as if she'd just tasted something sour, and her gaze, when it fell upon Nora, was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. A widow, alone, with a sick child and no visible means of support in Mrs. Purdy's ledger. This added up to a moral failing of the highest order. The bell above the door jangled violently, admitting a blast of wind and a stout, red-faced man who stamped the snow from his boots with loud, important thuds. It was Mr. Henderson, owner of the boarding house where Nora rented a small, cold room. He saw Nora immediately, his face clouding over. He strode toward her, his voice a low grumble meant only for her, but in the small, quiet store, every ear strained to listen. "Mrs. Hale," he began, not bothering with pleasantries. "The rent was due Tuesday. I can't run a charity." Nora's spine stiffened. She didn't turn fully to face him, keeping her body between him and Lily. "I'll have it for you, Mr. Henderson. I just need a little more time." "Time's up," he said flatly. "The doc told my wife your girl's cough is getting worse. I can't have sickness spreading in my establishment. You have until morning. Then the room is spoken for." He didn't wait for a reply. Turning on his heel and heading for the counter to buy tobacco. His duty done. The shame was a hot flush on Nora's cheeks. Every eye in the store was on her now, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and Mrs. Purdy's undisguised satisfaction. Nora took a deep, shaky breath, walked to the counter, and gently set Lily down on a stool. The child whimpered, her eyes fluttering open. "Just a moment, sweetling," Nora whispered, stroking her damp hair. She turned to Mr. "McKee, the medicine for Lily's cough. Please, Dr. Miller said you'd have it." Mr. McKee avoided her eyes, pulling a small, dark bottle from a shelf behind him. He set it on the counter. "That'll be $2.50. Nora." The words hit her like a physical blow. $2.50. It would leave her with next to nothing, not enough for food, and certainly not enough for the rent. She looked at the bottle, then at Lily's small, feverish face. There was no choice. Pride was a luxury for the warm and the well-fed. Survival was the only currency that mattered. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket. The coins felt cold and heavy. This was it, the end of the line. Tomorrow, she and Lily would be out on the street, in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard. The thought was a cold, hard knot of terror in her stomach. She was pulling the coins from her pocket when a low voice spoke from behind her, calm and clear, cutting through the strained silence of the room. "Your daughter needs a home, and my heart needs you, ma'am." Nora froze. Her fingers clenched around the silver dollars. The entire store went utterly still. The trappers stopped their murmuring. "Mr." Henderson paused with his tobacco pouch half open. "Even Mrs." Purdy's knitting needles ceased their furious clicking. The words hung in the air, audacious and achingly sincere. They were not a proposition of lust, but something else entirely, something raw, honest, and utterly bewildering. Slowly, Nora turned. Caleb Hart had pushed himself away from the flour sacks and was standing there, his hat now in his hands. His gaze wasn't on the gawking townsfolk. It was fixed on her, his expression serious, his quiet eyes holding an unexpected depth of warmth. He took a step closer, speaking directly to her, his voice low enough to feel intimate, yet firm enough for all to hear. "I'm not a man for fancy words. Mrs. Hale, I have a homestead, a few miles west of here. It's sturdy, it's warm, but it's empty. Too empty." He glanced at Lily, a flicker of a deep, old pain in his eyes. "I need help. Someone to keep the books, to manage the house. The work is honest. In return, I can offer a roof over your heads, food from my pantry, and I'll cover the cost of the medicine." He reached into his own coat and placed 3 heavy silver dollars on the counter next to the bottle. The sound of the metal on the wood was deafening. A scandalized gasp came from the direction of the window. "Well, I never misses," Purdy declared to the room at large. "An unmarried man and woman, living under the same roof, it's an affront to decency. It flies in the face of all that is moral and right." Caleb didn't even glance her way. His focus remained on Nora. He pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out to her. "It's a business arrangement. Ma'am, a partnership. Nothing more, unless someday we both decide otherwise. The directions to my place are on this paper." Mr. McKee cleared his throat, a sure sign he was about to impart some worldly wisdom. "He's a good man." "Nora," he said, his voice gruff with unspoken sympathy. "But Violet ain't wrong about how it'll look, especially now. Word is the Western Spur Railroad is putting a branch line through here come spring. Surveyors were here last month. Strangers are coming, and with them come new rules, new money. Folks are getting particular. Land values are going to change everything. He was warning her the informal tolerance of the frontier was about to be replaced by the rigid judgment of civilization. Nora looked from Caleb's outstretched hand to the judgmental glare of Mrs. Purdy, to the pity in Mr. McKee's eyes, and finally to the small, precious bottle of medicine on the counter. Caleb's offer was a lifeline. It was also a social death sentence. To accept would be to brand herself in the eyes of the town, to become a kept woman, a sinner in the sermons of Reverend Michael, her pride. The last tattered remnant of her former life screamed at her to refuse, to walk out with her head held high, even if it was into a blizzard that would swallow them whole. But then Lily coughed again, a weak, pathetic sound that shattered Nora's resolve into a million pieces. She looked at her daughter, at the fever-bright eyes and the small, chapped lips, and knew that her pride was worth nothing if her child wasn't safe. Her own reputation was dust in the wind compared to the warmth of a fire and a dose of medicine. Without a word, she reached out and took the folded paper from Caleb's hand. Her fingers brushed his, and she felt the rough callus of hard work and a surprising warmth that seemed to come from deep within him. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She pushed Caleb's silver dollars back toward him. "I have my own," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She placed her own coins on the counter, the sound a quiet echo of his. She would not take his money. Not yet. She would accept the chance he offered, but she would pay her own way for as long as she could. Picking up the bottle, she gently lifted Lily from the stool, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her. The child's weight was a familiar, aching burden. Ignoring the whispers that erupted behind her, ignoring the triumphant sniff from Mrs. Purdy, Nora walked to the door. She did not look back. She pushed the door open, and the storm welcomed her with a furious embrace. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and filled her eyes with stinging ice. She lowered her head, turning her back to the gale to shield Lily, and began the slow, arduous walk back to the boarding house. The street was a white, churning chaos. The warmth of the mercantile was gone, a memory already fading. In her hand, clutched so tightly the paper crinkled, was the address for the Hart homestead. It was a map to a place she'd never seen, a pact with a man she barely knew. It was a gamble of faith against a world that had offered her none. Back in the cold silence of her rented room, with the wind rattling the window pane like a hungry animal, she would have to choose between the pride that kept her upright and the hope, fragile as a sparrow's egg, that this quiet cowboy's offer was not another kind of trap, but the one thing she and her daughter needed most, a home. The night in the boarding house was a long, cold battle. Nora sat in a rickety chair, the thin blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, and listened to the two sounds that defined her world, the relentless shriek of the wind outside and the shallow, labored breaths of her daughter within. She had managed to get 2 doses of the medicine down Lily's throat, a bitter struggle that ended with the child falling into a restless, fevered sleep. The room was a pocket of profound cold, the meager fire in the grate having died hours ago, leaving only a pile of gray ash. Mr. Henderson had not seen fit to leave her any more wood. Pride, Nora thought, was a fool's companion in a blizzard. It was a fine coat for a sunny day, but it offered no warmth against a Wyoming winter. It couldn't fill a hungry belly or soothe a fever. As the first pale, bruised light of dawn seeped through the frosted window pane, her decision, which had been a desperate gamble, solidified into the only possible path. Her daughter's life was not a price she was willing to pay for the good opinion of Mrs. Purdy or any other soul in Sagebrush Crossing. She moved with a quiet efficiency born of long practice. She packed their few belongings into the small, battered trunk, 2 worn dresses, a change of clothes for Lily, her late husband's Bible, and a small tin box containing her marriage certificate and his letters. They were the meager artifacts of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She dressed the sleeping Lily in every layer of clothing she possessed, then wrapped her again in the blanket. Lifting her daughter was a familiar ache in her arms and back. The journey was a pilgrimage through a frozen hell. The snow was deeper than she'd imagined, coming up past her knees in places, a thick, pristine blanket that hid a treacherous, uneven ground. Each step was a monumental effort of will. The wind was a physical force, pushing against her, stealing the air from her lungs and whipping tears from her eyes that froze instantly on her cheeks. Sagebrush Crossing was quickly lost behind her, a few smudges of smoke against a vast, unforgiving whiteness. She followed the crude map Caleb had drawn, a single track leading west, a promise in the wilderness. The homestead was less than 3 miles from town, but it felt like 100. Twice, Nora stumbled and fell to one knee, the weight of Lily nearly pulling her down completely. Each time, she fought her way back up, her breath coming in ragged, burning gasps, her resolve a single, hot point in the freezing world. Lily did not stir, a dead weight in her arms, her fever a terrifying warmth against the biting cold. Nora's hope began to fray, the directions on the paper seeming like a cruel joke. Perhaps he hadn't meant it. Perhaps he had woken this morning and regretted his impulsive offer. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw it, a plume of smoke, thick and gray, rising straight into the air, a defiant column against the chaotic wind. It was a beacon, a sign of life. Renewed strength surged through her. She fixed her eyes on that ribbon of smoke and forced one numb foot in front of the other. As she drew closer, the shape of a small, sturdy log cabin emerged from the white haze, along with a barn and a series of corrals. It was a compact, well-kept place, built to withstand the fury of the land. Snow was piled high against the foundations, but the porch had been swept clean. She stumbled up the 3 wooden steps, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief, and raised a numb hand to knock. Before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung inward. Caleb Hart stood there, filling the frame. He was dressed for work, but his sheepskin coat was unbuttoned. The air that flowed out from the cabin was a wave of impossible warmth, thick with the scent of wood smoke, strong coffee, and a rich, simmering stew. He had been watching for them. The knowledge of it struck Nora with a force that nearly buckled her knees. His eyes took in their state in a single, swift glance, her exhaustion, the ice in her hair, the limp form of her daughter. He didn't waste a moment on words. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let me take her." He stepped onto the porch and gathered Lily from Nora's arms. He did it with a gentleness that was startling in a man so large, his hands cradling the child's head with unpracticed ease. He carried Lily inside as if she weighed nothing at all. Nora followed, stumbling over the threshold into the heat, the sudden change making her head spin. The main room was simple, practical, and impeccably clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire roaring within. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. Shelves holding tins and supplies lined another wall. It was a man's space, spare and functional, but it held a palpable sense of order. And yet, beneath the surface, Nora felt a profound and lingering emptiness, a silence that had nothing to do with a lack of sound. Caleb carried Lily directly to the hearth, laying her down on a thick bearskin rug before the fire. He expertly unwrapped the layers, his movements deft and sure. "She's burning up," he said softly, more to himself than to Nora. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a basin of cool water and a clean cloth. As he knelt to gently bathe Lily's face, Nora's gaze drifted around the room, trying to reconcile this quiet, caring man with the stranger from the mercantile. And then she saw it. Tucked in the far corner, almost hidden in the shadows, was a cradle. It was made of polished pine, beautifully carved with small, simple flowers along the headboard. A soft, hand-stitched quilt, patterned with bluebirds, was folded neatly inside. It wasn't dusty or forgotten. It looked as if it were waiting. The sight of it sent a cold spike of understanding through her. This was the source of the emptiness. This was his story. Caleb seemed to feel her gaze. He didn't look up from tending to Lily, but his voice was quiet when he spoke. It was my maze, my wife. He paused, his hand stilling on Lily's forehead for a moment. The influenza took her. Last winter, the baby with her. We were expecting a boy. The words were plain, delivered without a trace of self-pity, but they carried the weight of a canyon. Nora's own loss was a raw, recent wound, but this was an older, deeper kind of sorrow. It explained the look in his eyes at the mercantile, the reason he had seen not a fallen woman, but a mother with a sick child. He hadn't been offering charity. He had been answering a ghost. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. "So am I. Now, let's get your daughter settled." After they had given Lily another dose of medicine and tucked her into a warm bed in a small, adjoining room, Caleb showed Nora the rest of the cabin. It was larger than it looked, with 2 small bedrooms, the main living area, and a lean-to kitchen. The second bedroom was for her. A fire was already laid in its small hearth, waiting for a match. The bed was covered with a thick patchwork quilt, and a small wooden chest stood at its foot. He stood in the doorway, giving her space. "This will be yours and Lily's," he said. "You'll have your privacy here." He then laid out the terms of their agreement, his tone as matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the price of feed. "I keep my ledgers in that desk by the window. I'd be obliged if you could keep them current. There's mending to be done, and I'm a plain cook, at best. For that, I'll provide all your food and necessities. I'll also pay you a wage of $10 a month. It's fair, and it'll be yours to save or spend as you see fit." He met her eyes, his expression unreadable but earnest. "And just so the terms are clear, Mrs. Hale, these are separate rooms. They will remain that way. Until and unless a day comes when we both choose differently. My word is my bond." It was a declaration of honor, a line drawn in the sand against the assumptions of the world. He was giving her not just shelter, but respect. He was giving her agency. A weight Nora hadn't even realized she was carrying began to lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Caleb," he corrected her gently. "My name is Caleb." The first day passed in a quiet rhythm of care. Nora watched over Lily, whose fever, under the influence of warmth, medicine, and nourishing broth, finally began to recede. Caleb was a constant, quiet presence, moving in and out of the cabin to tend to his livestock, his movements economical and purposeful. That night, a new threat announced itself. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of brilliant stars and crystalline silence. And into that silence crept a sound that made the hair on Nora's arms stand on end, the high, lonely howl of a wolf. It was answered by another, and then a chorus. They were close. The sheep in the nearby pen began to bleat nervously. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, pulling his rifle from the pegs above the mantelpiece. "They're testing the fences," he said, his voice a low growl, drawn by the storm. Nora expected to feel a surge of fear. Instead, a cold, familiar calm settled over her. Her late husband, Robert, had been a hunter before he'd enlisted, and he'd insisted she learn to handle a firearm. "A woman alone needs to know," he'd said. "The world ain't always kind." While Caleb checked his load, Nora went to the corner where a second, smaller rifle rested. She picked it up, her hands moving with an assurance that surprised even herself. She broke it open, checked the chamber, and snapped it shut. The metallic click was loud in the quiet room. Caleb turned, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "My husband taught me," she said simply. answering his unspoken question. She moved to the cabin's single window, peering out into the moonlit snow. "I can stand watch from here." He studied her for a long moment, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Keep the lamp low. Fire only if they breach the fence. I'm going to move the flock into the barn." He slipped out the door, a shadow against the snow. Nora watched from the window, the rifle resting comfortably in her arms. She could see the dark shapes of the wolves, ghosting along the edge of the woods, their eyes gleaming like embers in the moonlight. They were a portrait of hunger and patience. Inside, she heard Lily stir and murmur in her sleep, a peaceful sound. Nora's resolve hardened into granite. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a guardian at her post. Caleb moved with a calm authority, his low voice soothing the panicked sheep as he guided them through the snow into the safety of the barn. The wolves circled, their howls growing more frustrated. But they never made a direct assault. They were opportunists, and the man with the rifle was not an easy opportunity. After a long, tense hour, their calls began to fade as they moved on in search of easier prey. When Caleb finally returned, his face was chapped by the cold, but his eyes were calm. He nodded his thanks to Nora as he put his rifle away. "They're gone for now. You did good." Later, they sat before the fire, the cabin silent and secure around them. Lily was sleeping soundly in the other room, her breathing finally deep and even. Her fever was gone. The warmth, the medicine, the safety it had worked. Caleb handed Nora a steaming mug of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the shared experience of the night, a silent acknowledgement of competence and trust. Nora looked at the man across from her, his profile etched in firelight. He spoke little, but his actions were a language all their own. He had offered a home, tended her child, respected her honor, and trusted her with a rifle. He had treated her not as a burden, but as an equal. This, she realized, was a form of justice she had forgotten existed, not the fickle justice of reputation or the cruel justice of survival, but a simple workman's justice, where a person was judged by what they could do, and care was a verb. For the first time in a very long time, Nora Hale felt the unmistakable, quiet comfort of being safe. The brutal fist of winter slowly unclenched its hold on the high plains. The blizzards gave way to days of brilliant, blinding sun on snow, and then, gradually, the thaw began. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a sound as persistent and hopeful as a ticking clock. Patches of brown earth emerged, smelling of mud and sleeping roots. For Nora and Lily, this slow awakening of the land mirrored the quiet thawing of their own frozen lives. A routine, as comforting as a well-worn blanket, settled over the Hart homestead. It was a life measured not in hours, but in shared tasks and quiet companionship. Mornings began before sunrise, in the warm, dark heart of the cabin. Nora would be the first to stir, adding logs to the embers in the hearth. By the time Caleb came in from the barn, his cheeks red from the cold, the smell of coffee would be thick in the air. They would sit at the rough-hewn table, often in a silence that was not empty, but full of unspoken understanding, watching the dawn paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and violet. After the simple breakfast, their paths would diverge. Caleb would head out to the fence line, his long-legged stride eating up the miles, checking for breaks the heavy snows had caused. Nora's domain was the cabin. She attacked the ledgers with a fierce concentration, her neat, precise script bringing order to Caleb's haphazard collection of receipts and notes. She discovered he was a better rancher than a businessman, often selling his wool for less than it was worth, and she made a silent vow to rectify that. She baked bread that filled the small home with a scent it hadn't known in years, mended Caleb's work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and scrubbed the floorboards until the pine grains shone. But the most profound change was in Lily. The warmth, the steady meals, and the absence of fear were a medicine more potent than any bottle. The color returned to her cheeks. Her thin frame began to fill out, and the ghost of a cough that had haunted her for months vanished completely. She followed Caleb around the homestead like a small, devoted shadow. Her eyes wide with wonder at the workings of the ranch, she learned the names of the horses, helped scatter feed for the chickens, and sat for hours on the porch, watching him work. And in the evenings, the three of them would gather by the fire. The day's labor would be done. The world outside dark and still. Sometimes, Caleb would tell stories of the land, of tracking antelope across the basin, or the time a sudden summer storm turned the creek into a raging river. Nora, in turn, would read from the single book of poems she owned. But mostly, it was Lily who filled the silence. Her childish chatter a bright, welcome music in the quiet cabin. Her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now echoed off the log walls daily. One evening, as Nora was putting a patch on Lily's dress, she looked up to see Caleb sitting on the hearth, a block of soft pine in one hand and a small, sharp knife in the other. Lily sat at his feet, her chin resting on her knees, watching in rapt silence as he worked. With slow, patient strokes, he began to carve. The wood shavings fell like pale curls onto the stone. Over the next few nights, a shape emerged from the block: a long neck, a flowing tail, 4 sturdy legs. It was a horse, captured in motion, its head held high. When he was finished, he sanded it smooth with a piece of leather until it felt like silk, and handed it to Lily. The child took the wooden horse with a reverence usually reserved for holy things. She clutched it to her chest, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb just nodded, a faint, shy smile touching his lips. He looked over at Nora, and in that shared glance, something profound passed between them. This was more than a business arrangement. This was the careful, tentative construction of a family, feeling a sudden need to contribute her own mark. Nora spent the next day taking down the faded, burlap sacks that served as curtains. She used the fabric from a dress she could no longer wear, a soft calico printed with tiny blue flowers, and sewed new curtains for the window. When she hung them, the afternoon light filtered through, casting a gentle, dappled pattern on the floor. It was a small thing, but the room felt different, softer. It felt like a home that had a mother in it. This fragile piece, however, was a bubble, and the sharp edges of the world lay just beyond the borders of the homestead. A month after her arrival, their supplies ran low, and a trip to Sagebrush Crossing became necessary. As their wagon rattled down the muddy track toward town, Nora felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The town had changed. The coming of the railroad was a fever in the air. Men in city clothes with measuring chains and tripods were a common sight. The price of everything at McKee's had gone up, and talk was no longer of weather and livestock, but of land deeds, easements, and property lines. With this new focus on money and law came a new, more rigid sense of propriety. As Nora and Caleb entered the mercantile, the casual conversation stuttered and died. Every head turned. The stares were no longer just curious. They were hard, judgmental. She could feel the whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves. At her back, Mrs. Violet Purdy stood near the counter, a formidable battleship in black bombazine. She gave Nora a look of pure acid, then turned her back in a deliberate, theatrical snub. But there was a new face in town, a man who stood beside Mrs. Purdy, his head inclined as she spoke animatedly in his ear. He was tall and slender, dressed in a tailored black suit that was utterly out of place. His hair was slicked back, his hands were soft and white, and he wore a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. This, Nora would soon learn, was Ezra Pike, a lawyer from Cheyenne, retained by the Western Spur Railroad. Later that week, word spread through the town. Mr. Pike, with the full-throated support of Mrs. Purdy and her Moral Reform Society, had convinced the town council to draft a community standards covenant. It was a document full of high-minded language about preserving the moral fabric of Sagebrush Crossing. But its true purpose was contained in a single, vicious clause. It forbade the cohabitation of unmarried men and women under a single roof. The penalty was a fine, but the unspoken threat was social ostracism, and Pike had added a particularly cruel amendment: any child living in such an arrangement would be deemed to be in an unsuitable environment, and their attendance at the public school, taught by the kindly Miss Maggie Quinn, could be revoked. The covenant was aimed at them like a loaded gun. The confrontation Nora had been dreading came a few days later. She had ridden into town alone to collect a parcel, leaving Lily in Caleb's care. As she was leaving the mercantile, Ezra Pike stepped into her path, blocking the doorway. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice as smooth as oiled leather. He tipped his hat. "A word, if I may." Nora stood her ground, her chin held high. "I'm busy. Mr. Pike." Of course. A woman of industry. His eyes roamed over her worn dress, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "I simply wish to offer a solution to your delicate situation. The town is concerned, you see, about appearances, about the child." "My child is safe, healthy, and happy," Nora said, her voice sharp, "which is more than I could say when we were living in town." Pike's smile widened, but it held no warmth. "Nevertheless, the law, or what will soon be the custom of this town, is the law." But he leaned in conspiratorially. "Men of influence can be reasonable. I understand you have a claim on a small parcel of land east of here, left by your late husband." Nora's blood ran cold. The land was a scrubby, worthless quarter section Robert had won in a card game. It was nothing, but it was hers, or it would be, once the probate was settled. "The railroad," Pike continued, "is in need of such parcels for the new branch line. They are willing to pay a fair price, more than fair. In fact, if you were to agree to sell, I'm quite certain I could persuade the town council that your living arrangement is a private matter, not worthy of public scrutiny. Your daughter's schooling would be secure. Think of it as one problem solving another." It was blackmail, plain and simple, dressed up in a lawyer's fine words. He wanted her land, and he was using Lily as a weapon to get it. A hot, furious anger surged through her, clearing away all fear. "My husband's land is not for sale, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice low and steady, "and my daughter's welfare is not a bargaining chip. Now, if you'll excuse me." She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his expensive suit, and walked out into the dusty street without a backward glance. She did not let him see that her hands were shaking. The ride home was a blur of righteous anger and rising dread. Pike was not a man who would be easily deterred. He had power, influence, and the town's prejudice on his side. When she arrived back at the homestead, the sight of Caleb and Lily sitting on the porch steps, the wooden horse between them, was a balm to her frayed nerves. But the peace was short-lived. A week later, the circuit rider, a grizzled old man who delivered the mail once a month, stopped at their gate. He had only one letter for them. It was addressed to her in a formal, looping script, the envelope bearing the official seal of the Laramie County Courthouse. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. Caleb stood beside her, his presence a silent, solid support. She unfolded the single sheet of paper and read. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the meaning was brutally clear. Her petition to assume the title of her late husband's property, a process that should have been a simple formality, had been delayed. A challenge had been filed. The letter stated that the claim was being held for further review pending clarification of the petitioner's moral standing and fitness to inherit. There was no signature at the bottom, only a clerk's official stamp. But Nora didn't need to see a name. She could feel his presence all over the document, in every cold and carefully chosen word. It was the elegant, cruel handwriting of Ezra Pike. He had been rebuffed in person, so now he was using the law itself as his weapon. The net she had felt tightening in town had just been drawn shut. The letter from the county courthouse lay on the mantelpiece, a stark white rectangle against the dark, seasoned wood. It was a silent, venomous thing, and its poison seeped into the fragile peace of the homestead. In the days that followed its arrival, a quiet tension settled over the cabin, as pervasive and chilling as a morning fog. The easy rhythm they had found was broken, replaced by a strained and careful politeness. For Nora, the letter was a public branding. It was Ezra Pike's voice, amplified by the authority of the law, declaring her unfit. The words moral standing echoed in her mind, a judgment that stripped away her dignity and painted her as the very thing Mrs. Purdy had always claimed she was a fallen woman. Her pride, which had sustained her through poverty and grief, now rose up like a cornered animal. Every kind glance from Caleb, every shared smile, felt like a debt she could never repay. She was a liability, a stain on his good name, a danger to his security. The thought of leaving became a constant, painful refrain in her mind. It would mean returning to the cold, to the uncertainty, to the edge of survival. But it would also mean freeing Caleb from the trouble she had brought to his door. She began to pull away from him, her conversations becoming clipped and practical, her eyes avoiding his, creating a chasm of silence between them that grew wider each day. Caleb felt the distance as a physical ache. The warmth that had begun to fill the empty corners of his home was receding, and the silence he had once found peaceful now felt hollow again. He saw the haunted look in Nora's eyes and knew its source was the letter on the mantel. But he was a man unpracticed in the language of feelings. He didn't know how to breach the wall she was building around herself. His own heart was a battlefield. The memory of his wife, May, was a gentle but persistent ghost. For a year, he had honored her by keeping his heart a locked room, a shrine to what he had lost. But Nora and Lily had, without asking, found a key. The sound of Lily's laughter as she played with her wooden horse was a sound of pure, unadulterated life. The scent of Nora's baking, the sight of her blue-flowered curtains catching the morning sun, these things had reawakened a part of him he thought had died with May. He felt a profound sense of disloyalty, as if choosing this new happiness was a betrayal of his grief. But the thought of the cabin returning to its former crushing silence was unbearable. He was caught between a past he couldn't change and a future he was terrified to claim. The sky, as if sensing the turmoil below, broke. A late spring storm rolled in, not with the dry fury of a blizzard, but with the cold, relentless misery of a drenching rain. For 2 days it fell, turning the hard-packed earth of the yard into a thick, greedy mud that sucked at the boots. The creek rose, its placid murmur turning into a sullen roar. On the second afternoon of the downpour, Caleb burst back into the cabin, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "It's the new heifer," he said, his voice tight with worry. "She's dropped her calf early, out in the south pasture. She's spooked by the storm and won't go to it." Nora didn't hesitate, while Caleb grabbed ropes and a lantern. She pulled on her heaviest shawl and a pair of Robert's old, oversized boots. Lily watched from the window, her face pale with concern. "Stay by the fire, sweetling," Nora commanded, her voice firm. "We'll be back." The world outside was a gray, churning chaos. The rain was as cold as ice, plastering their hair to their faces and soaking their clothes in minutes. The south pasture was a quagmire, the mud clinging to their boots like shackles. They found the calf huddled against a fallen cottonwood, a tiny, trembling creature, its coat matted with mud, its cries thin and pitiful against the drumming of the rain. What followed was a desperate, primal struggle. The mud fought them for every step. The calf was weak but slippery, all sharp angles and panicked motion. Caleb managed to get a rope around its middle while Nora held the lantern high, its flickering light a small, defiant beacon in the gloom. She shielded it with her body, protecting the fragile flame from the wind and rain. "We have to lift it," Caleb grunted, his muscles straining as he tried to pull the calf from the sucking mud. Together. Nora set the lantern down on a rock, its light casting long, dancing shadows. She plunged her hands into the cold, wet fur of the calf, her fingers sinking into the mud. Together. They heaved. The calf kicked, its small hooves finding no purchase. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. They were soaked to the bone, shivering, their strength failing. But then Nora saw the calf's eyes, wide with terror, and she thought of Lily, small and helpless in the blizzard. A fierce, protective strength surged through her. "Again," she gasped, and they put every ounce of their remaining energy into one last, desperate lift. The mud released its grip with a sickening slurp, and they stumbled backward. The calf finally free. The journey back to the barn was a slow, agonizing procession. Caleb half carried, half dragged the calf, while Nora went ahead, retrieving the lantern, her boots feeling as though they were filled with lead. They didn't speak. There was no breath for words, only for the shared, rhythmic gasps of exertion. Inside the barn, the air was warm and smelled of hay and animals. They settled the calf on a bed of clean straw, rubbing it down with dry sacks until its shivering subsided. Caleb managed to get a little warm milk into it. The small creature, exhausted, but alive, finally settled, its life saved by their shared struggle. They stood there for a long moment in the lantern light, covered in mud, dripping water onto the hay-strewn floor. The tension that had held them captive for days was gone, washed away by the rain and the urgency of their task. A shared, weary smile passed between them. They had fought nature together, and they had won. But the victory came at a cost. By the time they returned to the cabin, Nora was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. The cold had sunk deep into her bones. By nightfall, the chill had turned into a raging fever. The roles were now completely reversed. Nora lay in her bed, lost in the disorienting heat of the fever, and Caleb became her anchor. He sent a frightened Lily to her own bed with a gentle reassurance that he would take care of her mother. And then he began his vigil. All through the long, dark night, he sat in the chair beside her bed. He kept the fire in her small hearth fed and glowing. He brewed a bitter herbal tea from a recipe his mother had taught him, gently lifting Nora's head and helping her sip the warm liquid. He bathed her face and wrists with cool water, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed the damp hair from her forehead. He was a steady, silent presence, a guardian against the fever's tide. In those quiet, watchful hours, the walls around Caleb's heart finally crumbled. He looked at the woman in the bed, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. He saw not a burden or a complication, but a spirit of incredible resilience. He remembered her calm resolve the night the wolves had come, the fierce intelligence in her eyes as she worked on his ledgers, the raw courage she had just shown in the storm. He remembered the sound of her laughter, a sound he had never expected to hear in this house again. He glanced through the open bedroom door into the main room, toward the dark corner where May's cradle sat. For the first time, the memory of his wife did not bring a sharp stab of pain, but a gentle, melancholic peace. He had loved her. He would always love her. But the house had been a tomb, and he had been its willing caretaker. Nora and Lily had not desecrated the memory. They had filled the tomb with life, he realized, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. That honoring the dead did not mean refusing the living. To deny the feeling that was growing in his heart would not be an act of loyalty to May. It would be an act of cruelty to himself and to Nora. The fever broke just as the first gray light of dawn touched the window pane. Nora's eyes fluttered open. The fire in her mind had been extinguished, leaving behind a profound weakness, but her thoughts were clear. The first thing she saw was Caleb, asleep in the chair, his head slumped against his chest, his face etched with exhaustion. An oil lamp on the bedside table cast a soft, golden glow on his weary features. He had stayed with her all night. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her gasp washed over her gratitude, affection, a deep sense of being utterly and completely cared for. She stirred, and the faint rustle of the blankets was enough to wake him. He sat up, instantly alert, his eyes clearing as they focused on her. "Nora," he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "The fever's gone," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. He reached out and laid the back of his hand against her forehead. His touch was warm and sure. "Thank God," he breathed, a look of profound relief on his face. They looked at each other in the quiet dawn. The world stripped down to the small, warm space of the room. All the fear, the pride, the doubt, it all seemed to have been burned away by the fever and the long night. In the silence, a new truth took root. Nora slowly raised her hand, and he met it, his fingers lacing through hers. Their hands, one calloused and strong, the other slender and pale, rested on the patchwork quilt between them. He held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw the end of his own long winter. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low, raw whisper, repeating the words he had spoken in the mercantile. But this time they were not a public offer. They were a vow. "Your daughter needs a home," he said, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "And my heart needs you." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a homecoming she never thought she would find. She didn't need words. Her answer was in the way she tightened her grip on his hand, the way she used her faint strength to pull him closer. He leaned over the bed, and she raised her head to meet him. Their embrace was not one of passion, but of profound relief, a quiet, desperate, beautiful surrender. It was the feeling of two solitary souls finally finding shelter in one another. He held her for a long moment, then gently eased back, with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He stood and walked to the door, closing it softly behind him, leaving them in the privacy of the fire-lit room. Outside, the new day was breaking over the prairie, silent and full of promise. The contract was over. What was beginning was a family, chosen not by law or convenience, but by the undeniable truth of two hearts in a storm. The weeks that followed Nora's recovery were a season of quiet grace. The fragile bud of intimacy that had blossomed in the fire-lit sick room opened into a deep and steady affection that reshaped their world. The invisible line between their separate rooms dissolved, not in practice, but in spirit. The cabin was no longer his home where she and Lily were guests. It became, simply, their home. The unspoken contract was replaced by an unspoken covenant. Their days were still filled with the hard work of the ranch, but now it was a shared labor, lightened by easy companionship. They moved around each other with a fluid, unconscious grace, a silent choreography of two people learning the rhythms of the other's heart. A shared glance across the dinner table could convey a whole conversation. A light touch of his hand on her arm as she passed was enough to send a current of warmth through her. For Caleb, the house was no longer silent. It was filled with the low hum of Nora's singing as she worked and the bright, clear notes of Lily's laughter. For Nora, the vast, intimidating landscape of Wyoming no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like the backdrop to a life she was choosing, a life she was building. But while they were building a home, Ezra Pike was building a case. He and Violet Purdy were a fearsome alliance of cold ambition and fervent self-righteousness. They became a fixture in Sagebrush Crossing, moving from homestead to homestead, their weapons a lawyer's clipboard and a zealot's Bible. Pike, with his smooth talk of progress and property values, appealed to the townsfolk's greed and fear of the future. The railroad, he argued, would bring prosperity, but only to a town that presented itself as respectable and God-fearing. An orderly community, he purred, was a profitable one. Mrs. Purdy, in turn, worked on their souls. She spoke of moral contagion, of the sanctity of the family, and the dangerous example being set at the Hart homestead. She painted Nora as a temptress and Caleb as a man led astray, conveniently ignoring his long-standing reputation for quiet decency. But her most potent weapon was Lily. "Think of the child," she would say, her voice trembling with manufactured pity. "Growing up in a house of impropriety, her immortal soul in peril. It is our Christian duty to intervene." Their campaign was brutally effective. Few were brave enough to defy the combined power of the railroad's lawyer and the town's moral enforcer. A petition was drawn up and signatures were collected. A formal town meeting was called. The purpose, stated on the notice tacked to the door of the mercantile, was to discuss and ratify the Community Standards Covenant and to address the matter of the wardship of Lily Hale. Miss Maggie Quinn, the schoolteacher, rode out to the homestead herself to deliver the news. She was a plain, kind-faced woman in her 40s, with a spine of pure steel. "It's a trap." "Nora," she said, her hands twisting the reins of her horse, "they mean to give you an ultimatum. Either you and Caleb marry, right there and then, to make things illegitimate, or they'll vote to have Lily removed from your care. They'll call it temporary guardianship. Mrs. Purdy has already offered to take her in." The thought of Lily in the cold, judgmental clutches of Violet Purdy was a physical blow to Nora. She felt the air leave her lungs. "They can't do that," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He had been standing by the porch rail, his face a mask of cold fury. "There's no law that gives them that right." "Pike is clever." "Caleb," Maggie warned. "He's not using the law. He's using public opinion as a weapon. He'll make it seem like the compassionate choice, the only choice for the child's welfare, and once the town votes, he'll find a circuit judge to rubber stamp it." After Miss Quinn left, a heavy silence fell between Caleb and Nora. The solution seemed so obvious, so simple. Marriage. It was the word that now hovered between them, a word that had been a secret hope in both their hearts. But now, delivered as an ultimatum from their enemies, it felt tainted, ugly. That evening, the tension was a third person in the room. After Lily was asleep, Caleb finally spoke, his voice strained. "We could do it," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the fire. "We could get married. It would solve the problem." Nora's heart constricted. He said it as if he were talking about fixing a broken fence. It would solve the problem. She had dreamed of him asking her, of a proposal born from love, not from coercion. "So you would marry me to satisfy a town council?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He turned to her then, his face full of a pain she couldn't immediately understand. "I would marry you to keep you and Lily safe," he said, "but I won't do it this way. I won't have you shamed into it, standing up in front of them all, forced into a wedding like a common, like you'd done something wrong. It would be a humiliation. You deserve better than that. Nora, I won't do that to you." She heard his words, but her own fear twisted their meaning. She heard his reluctance to be forced, and mistook it for a reluctance to marry her. She saw him trying to protect her pride, but felt him pulling away. "So we do nothing," she countered, a desperate edge to her voice. "We let them take my daughter." "No, I'll fight them," he said, his frustration growing. "But I won't use our feelings as a legal defense in Pike's courtroom." The conversation ended there, in a painful stalemate. He was trying to protect her honor, while she was desperate to protect their family. Both of them were afraid he of shaming her, she of losing everything, and their fear had become a wall between them. 2 days later, the second attack came. The circuit rider delivered another official-looking letter. This one was addressed to Caleb. It was a formal notice of a legal challenge to his property lines. signed by Ezra Pike, acting on behalf of the Western Spur Railroad. It claimed that the original survey of the Hart homestead was non-compliant with territorial standards and that a portion of Caleb's western pasture, the very land bordering the proposed new rail line, was, in fact, public domain, subject to acquisition. It was a tangle of legal jargon, but the intent was clear to bury Caleb in a costly, time-consuming legal battle he couldn't possibly win. Pike was isolating him, cutting him off at the knees, ensuring that when he came for Nora and Lily, Caleb would be too distracted to fight back. The night before the town meeting was suffocatingly still. The air was heavy and close, the moon obscured by a low-lying haze. No one slept. Caleb sat at the table, staring at the legal notice, his face grim. Nora lay in her bed, staring into the darkness, the image of Lily being led away by Mrs. Purdy playing over and over in her mind. It was Lily who smelled it first. She crept into Nora's room, a small, frightened ghost in her nightdress. "Mama," she whispered, clutching the wooden horse. "The air smells funny, like bad smoke." Nora was out of bed in an instant. She threw open the door of the cabin and the smell hit her acrid, oily smoke, and beneath it, the unmistakable scent of burning hay. And then she saw the glow. A sickening, flickering orange light was coming from the direction of the barn. Caleb! The name was a scream torn from her throat. He was already moving, pulling on his boots, his face a stark white mask in the darkness. He grabbed 2 water buckets from by the door. "The hay barn," he grunted, and plunged out into the night. The small barn where he stored the winter feed was already a furnace. Flames licked up the dried timber walls, roaring as they consumed the hay inside. The terrified bleating of the sheep and the frantic whinnying of the horses in the main stable next to it was a sound of pure panic. Nora's mind went cold and clear. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Lily, get back in the house and stay away from the window," she commanded. Then she ran to the large iron bell Caleb had mounted on a post in the yard, the bell he used to call his ranch hands in a past life. She grabbed the thick rope and pulled with all her might. The deep, frantic clang echoed across the silent prairie, a desperate peal for help. Clang, clang, clang! An alarm in the night. Caleb had already thrown open the stable doors, the smoke and heat washing over him. The 2 horses were rearing in their stalls, their eyes wide with terror. He worked with a desperate, focused calm, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice as he unlatched their stalls and drove them out into the corral, away from the fire. Nora, her duty with the bell done, saw Caleb running back toward the flaming barn, the sheep he yelled over the roar of the fire. He plunged into the smoke-filled stable again, and Nora's heart stopped. She ran to the well, worked the pump handle until her arms screamed, and filled a bucket. Lily, disobeying her mother's order, appeared at her side, her small face smudged with soot, a tin cup in her hand. "I can help, Mama," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. For what felt like an eternity, they were a tiny, frantic fire brigade. Nora and Lily filled buckets, Caleb disappearing into the smoke and emerging moments later, coughing and choking, driving a few more panicked sheep before him. The heat was immense, blistering their skin. Sparks rained down around them. The roof of the hay barn groaned, the main support timbers glowing like embers. Finally, Caleb stumbled out with the last of the sheep, his shirt singed, his face black with soot. "That's all of them," he gasped, leaning against the corral fence. "The barn's lost." Just then, they heard the thunder of hooves. 2 of their neighbors, roused by the bell, rode into the yard together. The 4 men worked to keep the flames from spreading to the main stable and the cabin, creating a firebreak with shovels and wet blankets. By the time the roof of the hay barn collapsed in a final, spectacular shower of sparks, the fight was over. The fire, its fuel consumed, began to die down. Nora, Caleb, and Lily stood together, leaning against each other, their bodies aching, their lungs burning, watching the smoldering ruin. They had lost the barn and a winter's worth of hay, but the animals were safe. They were all safe. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Caleb walked slowly toward the wreckage, his neighbors following. He stopped near the spot where the barn door had been. He knelt, staring at the muddy ground, which had been softened by a leaking water trough. "What is it?" one of the neighbors asked. Caleb didn't answer. He just pointed. There, pressed deep and perfect into the mud, was a single boot print. It was not the worn, rounded heel of a cowboy's boot. This print was sharp, clearly defined, with a distinctive mark on the heel, a small metal plate, shaped like a crescent moon, a type sometimes favored by city men to protect their expensive leather soles from rough country wear. It was the print of a stranger who had no business being in their yard in the middle of the night, a stranger who had brought the fire with him. The day of the town meeting dawned gray and oppressive, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. The smoke from their ruined barn still hung faintly in the air, a bitter perfume that clung to their clothes and hair. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on Nora's shoulders, a deep ache in her bones that no amount of sleep could cure. Caleb was a thundercloud of controlled rage, his jaw set, his eyes dark with a fury he could not unleash. They rode to town in the wagon, a silent, grim pair, with Lily sitting between them, her small face a mirror of their anxiety. The meeting was held not in the church, but in the saloon, the only building in Sagebrush Crossing large enough to hold everyone. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust, stale beer, and nervous sweat. Nearly the entire town was there, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and a grim sense of civic duty. They parted to let Nora and Caleb pass, the whispers ceasing as they walked through, creating a wake of silence. Nora kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Ezra Pike and Violet Purdy stood at the front of the room, near the long, polished bar that was serving as a makeshift stage. Pike was the picture of confidence, his tailored suit immaculate, a sheaf of papers in his hand. Mrs. Purdy looked triumphant, her lips pressed into a thin line of vindicated piety, and sitting quietly at a small table to the side, observing the proceedings with hooded, intelligent eyes, was Judge Whitcomb. He was a circuit judge, an old man with a fringe of white hair and a face like a weathered map of the territory. His presence was unexpected, and it lent a solemn, official air to the ugly business at hand. Pike began, his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man merely presenting facts. He spoke of the future, of the great prosperity the railroad would bring. He spoke of the need for a strong, moral foundation to attract decent, hard-working families. He presented the Community Standards Covenant not as an instrument of persecution, but as a simple, necessary framework for an orderly society. "The issue before us," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, "is not one of punishment. It is one of protection. Protection for the standards of our community. And, most importantly, protection for the innocent." His eyes landed on Lily, who shrank closer to Nora. "We have here a child, a blameless little girl, being raised in an environment that is, by any civilized measure, irregular and improper. We have a document, signed by the majority of the good citizens of this town, expressing grave concern. The question is simple: do we, as a community, have a responsibility to act?" He ceded the floor to Mrs. Purdy, who rose like a storm crow, her black dress rustling. She needed no notes. Her sermon was etched on her heart. She spoke of sin, of temptation, of the sanctity of the holy bonds of matrimony. She painted a lurid picture of Lily's life, a life devoid of proper moral guidance, a life lived in the shadow of impropriety. "The Lord's work is often hard," she concluded, her voice ringing with emotion, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "But we must not shirk our duty. This child needs a firm, Christian hand to guide her. She needs a home where prayer is heard at the dinner table. If her own mother cannot provide such a home, then it is our solemn obligation to step in." The crowd murmured, their loyalties divided. Nora could see the conflict on their faces. Some, like the blacksmith and his wife, looked uncomfortable, their eyes full of sympathy. Others nodded along with Mrs. Purdy, their expressions hard and self-righteous. Throughout it all, Nora and Caleb stood silent. To speak would be to dignify the accusations, to engage in the theater of their own humiliation. But the shame was a physical thing, a hot, creeping flush on Nora's skin. She could feel the weight of every stare, every judgment. She felt stripped bare, her life, her choices, her very worth laid out for public dissection. It was then that she chanced a glance at Caleb. She expected to see defiance, anger. Instead, she saw an agony that mirrored her own. He was looking at her, at the rigid set of her jaw, the tremor in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. And in that moment, his resolve to protect her honor overrode everything else. He saw her pain, and he would have done anything to erase it. He leaned close, his voice a low, desperate whisper meant only for her. "Nora," he breathed, his heart breaking for her. "You don't have to stand here and take this. If you want to leave, if you want to take Lily and go somewhere you can find some peace, I'll give you every dollar I have. I'll understand." He meant it as an act of supreme love. He was offering her an escape, offering to sacrifice his own happiness for her well-being. He was telling her that her freedom was more important than his desire for her to stay. But Nora, her spirit already flayed raw by the public shaming, her soul weary from months of struggle, heard something entirely different. She did not hear an offer of escape. She heard an offer of dismissal. She heard the exhaustion in his voice and mistook it for defeat. In her vulnerable state, his words were not a shield, but a final, devastating blow. "If you want to leave," the words echoed in the sudden, desolate emptiness of her heart. He was letting her go. The fire, the legal threats, the public humiliation, it was all too much. She was a burden he was finally, gently, trying to set down. The light in her eyes died. A profound, chilling numbness settled over her. She gave him a single, brief nod, a gesture of such finality that it should have alarmed him, but he was too lost in his own misery to see it. He saw only her agreement to consider his offer, a way to end her suffering. The rest of the meeting was a blur. A vote was called for. A decision was postponed until the next day. Out of deference to Judge Whitcomb, the journey home was made in a silence so thick and absolute it felt like a physical presence in the wagon. The misunderstanding lay between them, a deep and silent canyon that neither knew how to cross. Back at the homestead, they moved like ghosts, performing the evening chores by rote. Caleb, believing he had offered her a choice, gave her space to think. Nora, believing she'd been cast aside, retreated into the cold, hard shell of her pride. This, she thought with a terrible, crystalline clarity, was the end. She had been a fool to believe in a safe harbor. The world was, as it had always been, a place where she and her daughter had only themselves to rely on. She would not be a burden. She would not wait to be told to leave again. That night, after Caleb had gone to the stable to check on the animals, and Lily was sound asleep, her wooden horse clutched in her hand, Nora pulled their small trunk from under the bed. Her movements were quiet, precise, devoid of all emotion. She folded her few dresses, her daughter's spare clothes. She took Robert's Bible and the tin box with her marriage certificate. She packed the new calico curtains she had sewn, a bitter reminder of a hope that had proven false. She was erasing herself from this house, from this life she had so foolishly begun to believe was hers. Her plan was simple. She would take the one horse Caleb had left in the corral and ride east. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she was leaving. She was just closing the lid of the trunk when she heard a soft, urgent knock on the cabin door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had Caleb come back? She stood frozen, unsure what to do. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the door and opened it a crack. It was Maggie Quinn. The schoolteacher stood on the porch, her face pale in the moonlight, a lantern in one hand and a roll of papers clutched in the other. She looked agitated, her usual calm demeanor gone.
"Nora, thank heavens,"
she whispered,
slipping inside. "I'm sorry to come so late, but I couldn't wait. I think I've found something."
Her eyes fell on the packed trunk, and a look of dismay crossed her face. "You're not leaving." "My presence here has caused enough trouble," Nora said, her voice flat and lifeless. "No," Maggie insisted, her voice fierce. "That's what he wants you to think. Pike doesn't care about morality. He cares about land. Look." She unrolled a large, yellowed paper on the table. It was an old plat map of the county. I remembered Caleb telling me once that his father had been on the original survey team for this area. I went through the old county records. This is the original survey map for the Hart homestead. And look here. She pointed a determined finger at a set of boundary lines. His property line extends a full 200 yards further west than on the new map Pike is using. Pike's claim is a fraud. He falsified the records. Nora stared at the map, the intricate lines blurring before her eyes.
"And there's more,"
Maggie said, her voice dropping lower. She pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. "I was at the Mercantile this evening. After the meeting, Mr. McKee was upset. He feels guilty. He said Pike has been buying an unusual amount of kerosene and lamp oil for late-night legal work. He claimed Mr. McKee kept the receipts." She smoothed the paper out on the table. It was a bill of sale from McKee's Mercantile, dated the night of the fire. It was for 2 large tins of kerosene. At the bottom was a scrawled, arrogant signature, Ezra Pike. The breath caught in Nora's throat. The boot print, the city-made boot with the metal plate on the heel. As if on cue, they heard the sound of a fast-approaching horse. Both women started, their eyes wide with fear. But it was only the telegraph boy from town. His horse lathered.
"A telegram for Mrs.
Hale," he said, handing a folded yellow envelope to Nora.
"Just came in from Cheyenne. The operator said it was urgent."
With trembling fingers, Nora tore it open. The message was short, printed in stark capital letters. "Mrs. Nora Hale, stop probate challenge. Dismissed. Stop title to property. Secured. Stop railroad holding company, only other interested party. Stop congratulations. Stop J. Peterson, attorney at law." She read it once, then twice. The pieces, scattered and confusing, suddenly slammed into place with the force of a physical blow, forming a single, horrifying picture. Pike. It had all been Pike. It was never about her. It was never about her morals. It was about her worthless piece of scrubland, which stood in the way of his railroad, and it was about Caleb's pasture land, which also stood in the way. He had used the town's prejudice as a smokescreen, her reputation as a weapon, and the law as a bludgeon to get what he wanted. And when that hadn't worked fast enough, he had used a torch. The cold numbness that had encased Nora's heart shattered, and in its place, a white-hot rage began to burn. The despair, the shame, the heartbreak, it was all consumed by a furious, righteous fire. She looked at the packed trunk, a symbol of her surrender, and a low, harsh sound escaped her lips. She wasn't a victim to be pitied or a sinner to be judged. She was a woman who had been wronged. She looked at Maggie, her eyes blazing in the lamplight.
"He isn't going to win,"
she said, her voice no longer the whisper of a broken woman, but the low, steady declaration of a fighter. "He is not taking my daughter. He is not taking this home. We are going to stop him." The fire was a ghost. It haunted the dawn, leaving behind a skeleton of charred timbers and the lingering stench of ash and despair. But in the cold light of morning, a different fire burned in Nora's eyes. It was a clean, hard flame of purpose. The trunk she had packed to flee in defeat now stood as a declaration of war. She was no longer running from Sagebrush Crossing. She was preparing to fight for her place in it. Caleb saw the trunk by the door, and his heart, already heavy, sank like a stone in a deep well. He had spent the night in the barn, his mind a torment of self-recrimination. His clumsy attempt to offer her freedom had clearly been heard as a rejection. He had seen the light in her eyes extinguish, and he knew, with a certainty that hollowed him out, that he had broken the fragile, beautiful thing they had begun to build. The packed trunk was the proof. He had driven her away. "Nora," he began, his voice rough with sleeplessness as she stood by the hearth, her back to him. "You don't have to. I didn't mean—" Before he could finish his fumbling apology, the sound of approaching horses and a wagon rattled the morning quiet. Nora turned from the fire, and the look on her face stopped him cold. It was not the face of a broken woman. It was the face of a general before a battle. "They're here," she said, her voice low and steady. Through the window, they saw Ezra Pike stepping down from a buggy, his movements crisp and confident. Beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Deputy Miller, a young man whose chin was still struggling to produce a respectable beard. "Stay inside with Lily," Nora commanded Caleb, her tone leaving no room for argument. She walked to the door, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch to meet them. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice carrying across the yard, as cold and clear as ice water. "You are not welcome on this property." Pike gave a small, condescending smile. "Good morning to you, too, Mrs. Hale. A tragic night. I hear you have my deepest sympathies." He gestured to the deputy. "Deputy Miller and I are here on official business. A simple matter of serving some legal documents. A routine inspection, you might say." Deputy Miller shifted his feet, avoiding Nora's gaze. "Ma'am, it's just a notice about the property line dispute, and a summons to the town meeting this afternoon about your daughter." Just then, Caleb appeared in the doorway behind Nora, his large frame filling it completely. His face was a thunderhead. "You've got a hell of a nerve." "Pike," he growled. "Coming here after what you did? Get off my land, now." Pike feigned surprise, placing a hand on his chest. "My dear Mr. Hart, I have no idea what you're implying. I am an officer of the court, merely doing my duty." He saw the packed trunk just inside the door, and his smile widened. "Ah, it seems Mrs. Hale has already made a sensible decision. Leaving, are we? Perhaps this whole unfortunate business can be resolved without any further unpleasantness." That was when Maggie Quinn rode into the yard, her face set and determined. She dismounted and strode toward the porch, a roll of papers in her hand. "Your official business is a fraud. Mr. Pike," she announced, her schoolteacher's voice ringing with authority. She held up the papers. "And your unfortunate business includes arson." Pike's smile faltered for the first time. He stared at Maggie, then at Nora, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. Nora turned to Caleb, her eyes blazing. "He set the fire. Caleb, he's been trying to steal your land and mine. It was never about us. It was always about the railroad." In a few terse sentences, she explained everything: the old map, the kerosene receipt, the telegram. The confusion on Caleb's face cleared, replaced by a slow, dawning, terrible understanding. The pain of their misunderstanding was momentarily burned away by the white-hot rage of betrayal. He looked at Pike, and the lawyer instinctively took a step back from the raw violence he saw in the quiet rancher's eyes. "The town meeting," Nora said, her voice like steel. "The whole town is going to hear this. Right now." The saloon was even more crowded than the day before. The air crackled with a tension that was almost unbearable. Judge Whitcomb was again in his place at the side table, his expression unreadable. Pike and Mrs. Purdy stood at the front, but their confidence from the previous day was gone. Pike looked rattled, his composure frayed at the edges. Mrs. Purdy looked confused, sensing the shift in the tide but not understanding its source. Pike tried to seize control, launching into his speech about moral duty, but his words rang hollow. The crowd was restless, their eyes shifting from Pike to the small, determined group that stood near the door: Nora, Caleb, and Maggie Quinn. Before Pike could finish, Caleb strode forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet fury radiating from him was enough to command the attention of every person in the room. "You've all heard Mr. Pike talk about morality," Caleb began, his voice low and steady. "Now I'm going to talk about facts." He unrolled the old survey map and tacked it to the wall. "This is the original survey of my land, drawn by my father. As you can see, my property line is 200 yards west of where Mr. Pike claims it is. His legal challenge is based on a forged map, designed to defraud me of the land the railroad wants." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. This was something they understood. Land. Deceit. Next, Maggie Quinn stepped forward. She held up the small, crumpled receipt. "This is a bill of sale from Mr. McKee's store," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "It's for 2 tins of kerosene, purchased by Mr. Pike on the night of the fire at the Hart homestead." The murmuring grew louder, more hostile. Every eye in the room was now fixed on Pike, whose face had gone pale. "Finally," Nora stepped forward. She held the telegram in her hand. "And this," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "is a wire from my lawyer in Cheyenne. It confirms that my title to my late husband's land is clear. The only other party who tried to claim it was a holding company for the Western Spur Railroad. Mr. Pike's legal challenge to my moral standing was a lie to pressure me into selling my land to him." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then she looked directly at the crowd, at the faces of the people who had judged her, whispered about her. "He used your fears and your prejudices as a weapon. He wrapped his greed in a cloak of morality and asked you to do his dirty work for him." The saloon erupted. The accusations were too specific, the evidence too compelling. The townspeople turned on Pike, their expressions a mixture of anger and shame. But for Nora and Caleb, the public trial was not over. The legal case was won, but the personal one was still in pieces. Caleb turned from the crowd and faced Nora, and in that moment, everyone else in the room seemed to fade away. His face was full of regret and a love so powerful it was painful to see. "I have to say something else," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, speaking only to her. "I love her. I love this woman." The crowd fell silent, listening to a confession far more profound than any legal testimony. "Yesterday," Caleb continued, his eyes locked on Nora's, "I saw the pain they were causing you, and I couldn't bear it. I was so afraid of you getting hurt, so afraid of losing you, that I acted like a coward. I told you that you could leave. I thought I was setting you free, but I was just pushing you away. It was the most foolish, most selfish thing I've ever done. Forgive me. Nora." Tears streamed down Nora's face as the last piece of the wall around her heart crumbled. She finally understood. He hadn't been casting her out. He had been trying to protect her. She, too, turned to face the town, to make her own confession. "I was afraid, too," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Ever since my husband died, I've been afraid of being hungry, of being cold, but mostly I was afraid of being labeled, of being a burden. I was so busy protecting my pride that I almost didn't see the truth when it was standing right in front of me." She looked at Caleb, her love for him shining in her eyes. "This man gave me a home when I had nothing. He protected my daughter. He respected me. He is a good and decent man, and I love him." In that moment of shared vulnerability, a profound quiet settled over the saloon. It was Judge Whitcomb who broke the silence. He rose slowly from his chair, his eyes fixed on Pike with a look of cold contempt. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice like the crack of a whip, "this body has heard compelling evidence to support criminal investigations into fraud, coercion, and arson. I will be issuing a warrant for your arrest." He then turned his gaze to the assembled townspeople. "As for this covenant," he said, gesturing dismissively at the petition, "it has no legal standing whatsoever. The law is concerned with a child's welfare, not a town's gossip." His eyes softened as he looked at Nora, Caleb, and Lily, who had run to her mother's side. "I have seen this child. She is safe, she is healthy, and she is loved. That is the only moral standing that matters in my court." A collective sigh of relief and shame went through the crowd. But before the deputy could move to arrest Pike, a new sound intruded, a low, distant rumble that grew rapidly louder. It was thunder. The sky outside had turned a bruised, violent purple. A sudden, furious gust of wind rattled the saloon doors. The storm broke with a terrifying violence. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. A jagged fork of lightning lit the room, followed an instant later by a deafening crash of thunder. And then came a new sound, a deep, grinding roar. The blacksmith, who had been standing near the door, paled. "The creek," he yelled. "It's a flash flood." The dry creek bed that ran along the edge of town, a place where children played in the dust, had become a churning, muddy torrent. It was rising with terrifying speed, threatening the town's most vital asset, the communal grain storehouse, which stood on the low ground near the bank. Panic erupted, but Caleb's voice cut through the chaos. "Buckets, shovels. We have to save the grain." In an instant, the town was transformed. The petty squabbles and moral judgments were washed away by the primal urgency of survival. Men who had been on opposite sides of the vote moments before now worked shoulder to shoulder, grabbing burlap sacks, filling them with dirt, and running to build a makeshift levee against the rising water. Caleb was at the center of it, a natural leader, his quiet strength a calming influence in the chaos. Nora, too, sprang into action. "The children, the elders," she cried to the other women. "To the church, it's on high ground." She organized them with a calm efficiency, gathering the frightened children, helping the older folks through the deepening mud and driving rain. In the midst of this frantic, unified effort, one man moved against the tide. Ezra Pike saw his chance. While everyone else was fighting to save the town, he slipped out the back of the saloon. He ran to his buggy, his fine city shoes slipping in the mud, his only thought to escape before the deputy remembered him. His panicked, selfish flight was a stark contrast to the selfless bravery of the townspeople. The battle against the flood was brutal and exhausting, but they held the line. As the rain began to slacken, the muddy water lapped at the top of their makeshift wall but did not breach it. The grain was safe, soaked, shivering, and covered in mud. The townspeople stood together, looking at the work they had done. Just then, a cry went up. Deputy Miller was leading a sputtering, mud-caked Ezra Pike back toward the saloon, a firm grip on his arm. As the chaos subsided, Mrs. Purdy stood alone near the church steps, her fine dress ruined, her moral certainty washed away. She watched as Nora and Caleb, their faces streaked with grime, found each other in the crowd. Lily, seeing them, broke away from the other children and ran, splashing through the puddles. She threw her arms around Nora's legs, and Caleb's arm came around them both, pulling them into a tight, protective circle. They stood there, in the middle of the mud and the aftermath of the storm. A man, a woman, and a child. Their faces weary, but their bond unbreakable. For the first time, Violet Purdy saw them not as sinners, but as they truly were, a family, forged in fire and flood, standing together against the storm. And for the first time in a very long time, she bowed her head in silence. The flood receded as quickly as it had come, and leaving behind a scarred landscape of glistening mud and debris. But it had washed the town clean of more than just dust. in the shared struggle against the uncaring fury of nature. The poison of suspicion and judgment had been diluted, replaced by the simple, profound solidarity of neighbors. The town of Sagebrush Crossing had been fractured by a man's greed, but it had been brought together again by a river's rage. The healing began the very next day. Ezra Pike was gone, escorted by Deputy Miller to await the next stage to the county jail in Cheyenne. His departure left a vacuum, and into it flowed a quiet, communal sense of shame, followed by a wave of neighborly redemption. It started with the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, who arrived at the Hart homestead at sunrise with his 2 sons, their wagon loaded with salvaged timbers and a promise to help rebuild the hay barn. He didn't say much, just nodded at Caleb and set to work, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a form of apology and a promise of support. Soon after, others came. Mrs. Miller, the deputy's wife, brought a basket filled with fresh bread, a jar of preserves, and 2 whole chickens. She pressed it into Nora's hands, her eyes full of a remorse that needed no words. The family whose farm bordered Caleb's to the east brought a wagon load of hay from their own stores to replace what had been lost. Mr. McKee arrived from town, not to collect a debt, but to extend a line of credit at the mercantile. "For whatever you folks might need," he'd said, gruffly clearing his throat. Even those who had been the most vocal in their condemnation offered silent amends. One morning, Nora found a neatly tied bundle of quilt squares on the porch, left by a woman from Mrs. Purdy's Moral Reform Society. There was no note, none was needed. It was a peace offering, a stitch in the torn fabric of their community. Violet Purdy herself was not seen. She had retreated into her home, the curtains drawn, her public authority shattered, leaving her with nothing but the silence of her own convictions. Maggie Quinn was their most steadfast champion. She marched into the next school board meeting and, with the quiet backing of Judge Whitcomb, made it clear that any further discussion of Lily Hale's suitability would be considered an act of malicious gossip, unworthy of the town's attention. Lily was welcomed back to school not with stares, but with shy smiles from the other children. For the first time, she was just a little girl, no different from anyone else. As the new barn rose, timber by timber, under the warm summer sun, so too did the last walls between Nora and Caleb crumble, their love, confessed in a moment of public crisis, now settled into a deep, quiet certainty in the privacy of their home. The fear and misunderstanding that had almost torn them apart had been replaced by a fierce, protective tenderness. They had faced the worst of nature and the worst of man, and they had not only survived, they had found the unshakable center of each other. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the vast Wyoming sky in strokes of orange, pink, and deep purple, Caleb stood on the porch, his knife and a block of wood in his hand. But he wasn't carving a toy. He led Nora and Lily to the front door of the cabin, to the thick, weathered pine lintel that ran above the frame. "A house isn't a home until it knows the names of its family," he said softly. With slow, deliberate care, he began to carve into the wood. He was not a man of letters, but his hands were steady and sure. He carved his own name first, the letters deep and strong in Caleb. Then, beside it, he carved Nora, the lines a little softer, more graceful. Finally, at the end, smaller and cherished, he carved Lily. He ran his calloused fingers over the 3 names, a permanent declaration etched into the very heart of the house. He turned to Nora, the last light of the day catching the raw emotion in his eyes. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. He took her hand, his voice low and full of a year's worth of unspoken feeling. He repeated the words that had started it all, but they were no longer a desperate offer in a crowded store. They were a sacred vow, spoken under the wide and endless sky. "Your daughter needs a home," he said, his gaze holding hers, "and my heart needs you." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening. Not just today, forever. Nora's answer was not in words. It was in the tears of pure joy that traced paths down her dusty cheeks, in the way she stepped forward into his embrace. A perfect and final homecoming. Lily, sensing the monumental importance of the moment, wedged herself between them, wrapping her small arms around both their legs, anchoring them to this spot, to this new and certain reality. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was as simple and honest as the land itself. A week later, on a sun-drenched afternoon, they gathered under the shade of the ancient cottonwood tree by the creek. Judge Whitcomb, his judicial robes replaced by a simple Sunday suit, officiated. Their guests were the people who had stood by them: Maggie Quinn, Mr. McKee, Gus the blacksmith and his family, and the handful of other neighbors who had chosen kindness over judgment. Nora wore her one good dress, a simple blue calico, and in her hair, she had woven the small, hardy purple wildflowers that grew along the creek bank. Lily, in a freshly washed and mended dress, stood beside her, clutching her precious wooden horse. Caleb stood tall and straight, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean shirt and trousers, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. The judge's words were few but heartfelt, speaking not of laws and contracts, but of the resilience of the human heart and the simple grace of finding a partner to face the wilderness of the world. When he pronounced them man and wife, Caleb did not kiss Nora with a fiery passion, but with a quiet, profound tenderness, a sealing of a promise that had already been made and kept 100 times over. That night, after their friends had departed, a deep and peaceful quiet settled over the Hart homestead. A gentle fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the log walls. Lily was asleep in her room, her wooden horse resting on the windowsill as if standing guard, a silent testament to a childhood now safe and cherished. Nora and Caleb stood before the fire, his arms wrapped around her from behind, her head resting against his chest. They looked at the names carved above the door, now sanctified by a vow and witnessed by their community. They had faced the wind and the snow, the wolves and the flood, the judgment of the righteous and the greed of the powerful. They had been stripped down to nothing but their courage and their conviction. The railroad would come. Its steel tracks would cut across the prairie, bringing with it a new world of noise and speed and strangers. Sagebrush Crossing would grow and change, its simple frontier justice perhaps giving way to a more complicated and less personal future. But here, in this small cabin, under a vast and star-dusted sky, they had built something the changing world could not touch. It was not just a homestead, it was a sanctuary. It was a place of quiet justice, of steadfast love, and of a family, not of blood, but of choice, a home that they would wake up and choose, together, every single day, forever. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people just like you.